Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you as always in Berlin, Germany. Joining me in Berlin, although not in the same location, is FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, Adam Tooze. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam. Yeah, Berlin, big city. In fact, I am only just down the road from Cam. But busy afternoons.
Yeah, so willkommen, as they say here. But two segments for you all in the second half of the show. We're going to be doing something loosely pegged to the Oscars ceremony happening this weekend. There's one movie in contention called The Brutalist, about a architect from the Brutalist School of Architecture that's in competition for some of the big prizes. So yeah, we thought we would talk about the movement, if not the film, which I don't think either of us have seen. So a segment on brutalism after the break. But first, another data point for you all, and that is $5 million. That is the apparent price of a so-called gold card that President Donald Trump announced this past week that would offer a pathway to permanent residency and then citizenship, potentially, opened up specifically to high-level people, as Trump calls them, from around the world, namely people willing to pay $5 million for the card.
As a pathway to American citizenship, the president telling reporters he wants to replace the EB-5.
It's somewhat like a green card, but at a higher level of sophistication. It's a road to citizenship for people. And essentially people of wealth.
Gold card holders will only be taxed on their domestic U.S. income. Their overseas income will be exempt. Attorneys say it's the only way that the global rich would actually want to become U.S. residents.
It's one aspect of the Trump administration's immigration policy, and a potentially surprising part. Obviously, Trump, of course, campaigned as a hardliner on immigration. There's been less talk of his famous wall along the border with Mexico, but his administration has been trying to deport people in the country without permission or otherwise a visa, and trying to deter anyone from entering the country to claim asylum. And he's not alone in that goal. There are governments across the West that have been taking turns against immigration, including the one we're in now. Germany, right after an election this past week, will have a chancellor who campaigned on severely restricting immigration rights in the country as well. So yeah, we thought we'd take a general look at the state of immigration in the West and the United States, maybe more specifically. But to start off with, Adam, as I mentioned, it is remarkable right now that immigration politics across the West seems to have turned against immigration, and more or less at the same time. Immigration all of a sudden seems to be pretty unpopular everywhere. And I'm just curious why you think that might be the case.
Yeah, it's clearly true that is the case, right? Quite contrary to the silly rhetoric that Vice President Vance deployed at the Munich Security Conference, where he, postured as though, Europe was some sort of haven of liberal multiculturalism that he had to bring the truth to. In fact, the bitter reality of European politics, exactly as you say, is that xenophobic, anti-immigrant, racist politics are absolutely all the rage here in Europe at this moment. And furthermore, I think the simplest answer to your question is simply at that level of politics in democracy right now, pandering to anti-immigrant sentiment, refusing to offer serious arguments against it, indulging it as though it actually amounted to an either a reasonable values-based position or one that could really be seriously based in economic evidence, has become the norm. And then the sort of like second level pandering, where we have to make excuses for people who are making excuses for people who are more or less openly advocating various types of xenophobic politics. I mean, we can differentiate to some degree. I think in the US case, anti-immigrant sentiment is racial above all. It's anti-Latino, and in some of the new centers of migration, it's anti-Black because of the prominent presence, especially of Francophone Africans, say in New York right now. It's very noticeable. Whereas I think in much of Europe, it's above all Islamophobic, in Islamophobia that's really at the center of anti-immigrant sentiment. And this is, of course, fed by the other extra kind of appalling element of race relations in Europe right now, which are these copycat and mock attacks by disaffected asylum seekers and migrants in Germany, which are not dramatic acts of terrorism, but of course they spread fear and terror and horror to the people that are immediately impacted by them, and they create a toxic loop which political entrepreneurs from the far right, but also the centre right and even elements of social democracy ride in on. If you're really trying to find a specific explanation for this chronological overlap, I mean, this drift has been, present in European and American politics for many years, but the sudden escalation, I mean, I was thinking it might have something to do with COVID, in that there's a synchronization that results from the fact that COVID really halted migration across many of the most important avenues of migration. And then what we saw was a catching up, a backlog of migration demand, which manifested itself very, very dramatically in 2021, 2022, 2023. And when you combine that with the distributional struggles that we saw around the burst of price increases, 21, 22 and early 23, I think you put that together and you have the ingredients for a sudden lurching escalation of anti-migrant talk. But I do think ultimately this is mainly to do with the political Overton window shifting progressively further and further to the right. And somebody like Friedrich Merz, the prospective Chancellor of Germany, who opened the window, the door, the possibility to collaboration with the far-right AfD on this issue, is clearly quite deliberately experimenting with what he can get away with.
Yeah, I do wonder if there's something cyclical about it. I mean, I don't know if there have been kind of other moments in the past where this kind of anti-immigrant sentiment increases and then declines at some point, only to return again. But
it's certainly it has ups and downs. Whether one would want to claim it was strongly cyclical, I don't know. But notoriously in the case of Britain, the years immediately before the Brexit referendum saw a surge in anti-immigrant sentiment, which literally in the months after the Brexit referendum dramatically subsided. And so, many people that bewail and bemoan, as I do, the outcome of that referendum, will never get over the extraordinarily unfortunate timing of that vote. So I definitely agree with you that this comes and goes and it escalates and then de-escalates. And the mere election of a right-wing, xenophobic, anti-immigrant party can often change the picture of sentiment, as we've seen in Italy, where the issue which was hugely salient for many years has dropped down the agenda of Italian public debates since they brought a Fratelli government to power. And that can't be explained by the actual flow of migrants or the degree of deportation. There's something that the anti-immigrant voters want, which is the sense of being listened to and represented in power above all else, rather than really, change circumstances on the ground, which are in fact debatable as to what impact migrants actually have in the societies that receive them.
Yeah, I guess with that, I'd be curious to turn to this golden visa policy that I mentioned Trump announced this week. We don't know for sure if it will go into effect. Trump has a habit of declaring policies that don't go anywhere, but there are similar types of visas. And in fact, the United States has had a similar investor visa in place. Trump offers his unique branding with the golden visa name, but I'm curious what we could learn from the experience of these investor visas elsewhere. I mean, who tends to take up this offer when it's available, and is this an invitation for potentially criminal activity, for people interested in money laundering or corruption or other kinds of nefarious activities? Can they find an avenue with these kinds of viable visas?
I mean, it's worth just being really precise about this, right? This is actually called the gold card. It's literally as though he was selling credit cards. And unlike your standard golden visa scheme, as far as I understand it from the reporting, the idea is that you buy this, right? So the standard golden visa scheme is that you demonstrate that you're bringing investment to the country by investing, and it can be buying a piece of real estate, but it can also be, of course, a business venture. Whereas as far as I understand the Trump scheme, the way it's being reported is that you pay the Trump administration $5 million and then you get the gold card. So it is in both respects, like both in its branding and in its underlying logic, the crassest of the crass options here, and seems perhaps to have something to do with Trump's increasing move to think of tariffs as well as revenue-raising devices, right? They're not first and foremost about economic policy. They're fiscal mechanisms for actually just bringing in revenue to the government because they've got, a whole bunch of contradictions to sort out with talking tough about deficits and actually wanting to do huge tax giveaways. And the way you square that contradiction in their own minds is to promise to raise huge amounts of revenue through tariffs. It's all, but I mean, it goes back to our diagnosis of, MAGA politics, or in this case, I think this is less MAGA than Trump personally. It's just bullshit. Like it makes no sense. It's what we were saying about the Munich and Vance and Trump policy in general. And we're seeing now in this week the signing of the actual Ukraine minerals resources deal, which turns out to actually deliver virtually none of the exorbitantly insane things that Trump demanded. I think this gold card model will follow the same pattern. There's no evidence from serious work in Europe where rich societies, as opposed to just tax havens, have, the Portugals, the Spains, the Greeces of this world have offered various types of golden visa scheme. There's no evidence that they bring in substantial investment. The investment that does take place tends to be in real estate, which is relatively unproductive. And if you look at the sort of people that sign up for them, we'll just do the maths, right? Who is it who's got $5 million lying around and is sufficiently desperate to spend that on some other passport? And the answer is it's Chinese and Russians. Like that's, if you look at the data, they account between them for 85 to 90% of the people that have taken up these schemes. So basically what you're doing is offering an avenue for flight capital to the bourgeoisie of China and Russia. And if that's the plan, well, fair enough. But we shouldn't make bones about what the actual logic and what this will do and what avenues it will create. So I think this is it's Trump MAGA BS. It's that kind of policy. Whether it gets done or not, it'll have no significant impact. But he'll be able to claim that he did a bunch of things and attracted talented, wealthy, successful people to the US. Yeah,
this does get at the heart of a tension, if that's not too dignified a word, in the MAGA coalition, the Trump coalition, on this question of immigration. There is a widespread consensus in the Republican Party to deport low-skilled immigrants and to prevent asylum seekers from entering the country. But the question of high-skilled immigration, there seems to be a split. And I'm curious what the opposing worldviews involved are here. I mean, it seems on one hand, there's a kind of neoliberal view, perhaps represented by the Silicon Valley representatives in the administration, that are very eager to find avenues for high-skilled immigrants to continue entering the country, including, at least theoretically, with this gold card scheme. And then there's the opponents of immigration writ large, and I'm curious whether they're more drawing on this kind of bounded market that we discussed in a previous episode, this idea that there need to be boundaries that are setting the national economy off from the rest of the world.
Yeah, I do realize, talking about this kind of stuff, that I just have so little patience for the anti-immigrant position that, I find it very difficult to even keep my cool talking about this stuff. I mean, I was on an H-1B visa to the United States. H-1B visas are a mechanism through which America organizes the global brain drain. I mean, anyone who's able to persuade themselves that this is bad for America's policy, bad for its economy or bad for the American society, is a fool. And I'm not going to pretend they're anything other than a fool, right? And they're pandering. It's ridiculous. We think, the numbers aren't very good, but there's about 600,000 people in the US maybe on H-1B visas. And this is a hand-picked group of people with particularly high qualifications and skills. There's about 120,000 new ones issued every year. And of course, they go to pushy employers that are desperate to access a very high skilled, and in some cases, compared to local talent, relatively affordable types of software engineering, for instance. So it's quite clear that Silicon Valley likes to bring in Indian software engineers on these kind of visas. But we're talking about very modest numbers of people in sectors which are very rapidly expanding and on the whole offer very substantial growth opportunities. So, it's not surprising to me that we saw a division, and, you've got to date stamp everything you say about this. So this really brew up over December, January, when there was a real ding-dong battle between Bannon and Musk over this, because Musk, as a business person from California and Silicon Valley, is obviously, broadly speaking, pro H-1B visas. He came one-on-one himself, or anyway, he's obviously a migrant, a highly skilled migrant to the US, whereas Bannon was running this, this outlandish kind of conversation about describing H-1B as a total scam. I mean, it's nonsense. The vast majority of very highly qualified migrants to the US come on this visa. It's not a scam. But then, what was really typical of this moment is that you have Ro Khanna from, the Democrats from the Valley, and then Bernie Sanders piling in on this. And his rhetoric is the main function of the H-1B visa program is not to hire the best and the brightest, but rather to replace good-paying American jobs with low-wage indentured servants from abroad. I mean, this, to my mind, is the populist mind virus kind of spreading across the American political system. That's not an adequate or very reasonable description of the H-1B program and the way it operates. And it's insulting to those of us who were on that program and will in future be citizens of the United States. And it's hard to forget being described in those terms, because it's just not this is part of this sort of metastasizing incomprehension, or it's not even that. These people know perfectly well that this is essentially just populist. It's cheap populist talk.
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify one aspect of the H-1B program that I think I read in Bannon's own comments. Are the recipients of that visa, you obviously then would know, bound to a single employer?
Depends which category of H-1B you come under, I think. And how you then graduate from it, right? Because it's a standard route to graduate from an H-1B to a green card. And so you don't remain permanently attached to that employer. And the employers, it's quite clear that certain employers in Silicon Valley cycle tens of thousands of people through this scheme. It's just very difficult, I think, to demonstrate that really does any damage to the United States, right? The idea that there's a kind of dual labor supply here, and there's unfree labored, low-waged, indentured servants being brought in from abroad. This is 18th and 19th century American political rhetoric gone wild.
Yeah, I guess we would take a closer look then at the overall effects of immigration on local labor markets. This is obviously a large part of the rhetoric used against immigration, that it affects workers negatively who are already in these markets. Yeah, what are the effects, as best we can tell, positive or negative for existing workers?
Yeah, I mean, this is when we begin to talk about migration as a mass phenomenon, right? Not the H-1B niche element, which attracts headlines and high stakes involvement, but migration as a mass phenomenon. And there, I think the questions are more reasonable about what impact it has. It would be, I think, bizarre to tell the economic history of the United States from the 19th century onwards and to deny that migration has an impact on the American labor market. Of course it does. In fact, we have very good, very strong econometric evidence to the effect that it shifted the balance of power between capital and labor in favor of capital in the late 19th and early 20th century, and has gone on doing so in certain key respects. We know that in the recent business cycle, so the crash of 2020, the very rapid recovery, and then the slowdown, we believe that, in the words of economists, the surge in migration post-COVID had a quote-unquote cooling effect on the American labor market. But again, I think it really pays to be just a little bit more precise. And you don't need to be a lot more precise to see where this principally is working, right? So if we break down the foreign-born labor force in the United States right now, it's about 18.6% of the US labor force. The illegal migrant flow constitutes about 5% of the American workforce. So we've got, slightly less than 1/3 of the foreign-born workforce in the United States is undocumented. The overall picture for economic evidence on the impact of migrant flows, both documented and undocumented, is they're broadly speaking neutral or positive in the US labor market. But where I think one would expect impacts to work is at the bottom end of the American labor market, where essentially undocumented and new arrivals compete with existing arrivals. And I don't think, you don't have to live in the United States for very long to realize that the migrant labor market is highly segmented by ethnicity, by race, by culture, by language. And where this impacts most is clearly in the Latino labor force, right? So half the foreign-born labor force in the United States, so about 9% of the labor force, is Latino. 75% of the undocumented labor force in the United States is Latino. And if you then look at what kind of skills these different labor forces have, then in general, folks like myself, non-American born foreign workers in the United States have higher educational qualifications than our American counterparts and earn more than our American counterparts. The exception are Latino migrants to the United States who have markedly lower levels of education than the native population. And in this group, we see this remarkable inversion where, for instance, for black workers, non-native born black workers in the United States earn marginally more than native born black workers. But with Latino workers, it's different. So Latinos working in the United States who are native born earn $947 a week. Non-native born Latinos in the United States earn $792. So in that segment, which is, roughly half, 9% roughly of the American labor force, where you have a low-skilled labor force segmented by language, because many of these migrant workers don't have good English. They come in with poor education. Some arrive documented, some arrive undocumented. And I think in that segment where we have clear evidence of a downward wage gradient for the new arrivals, you would expect the wage pressure to be really intense. And that's where the undocumented group, 75% of the undocumented workers are Latino. So it's in those markets, in those labor markets, in those regions where I think you would expect the impact, the labor market impact at least, to be most severe, most severely felt. And I don't think it's surprising, therefore, to see a shift in the political attitudes and the political alignment of the Latino population in the United States towards parties which are more restrictionist. Because if there's any group in the US that actually suffers the impact of a surge in large-scale migration and undocumented migration in particular, it's them.
I guess I want to shift focus a bit to the people who have been deported and are being deported by the Trump administration to their home countries. And I'm curious, how do deportees reintegrate into their home countries after potentially having lived in the United States for a long time, or whatever home country they happen to be in, or whatever country they happen to have been living and working in? They're returning to their home countries after some time. I mean, what policies do those receiving countries need to receive and integrate them?
Yeah, so here it's really important to differentiate between two different types of coercive action being undertaken by the American state against migrant populations. Like, one is the arrest and remove, which is happening at the border. Another is the actual just pushback that's happening at the border. So those are people that have migrated on foot, often over huge distances, to the US border and are now being expelled from the US. And then there's the other headline-grabbing element of this, which is, classic deportation. In other words, arrests by ICE squads that go around migrant communities in American cities, arrest people, hold them, detain them, resolve the case, and then deport them by airplane, generally speaking. They're flown home. The pushback, the arrests, the expulsions at the border are numerically much larger. But the intrusion into established migrant communities in the US is, of course, far more wrenching and dramatic when it's a case of arrest by ICE and then deportation, often over very long range by airplane. And those are the people for whom this question of reintegration really arises, because they are physically taken from the US and plonked back, on the landing strip in an airport in their home country. And there is real diplomacy about this, right? So Marco Rubio has, over the last couple of weeks, been traveling around Central America, making deals with Central American governments to agree to an escalation of the American deportation program and the receipt of more deportees from the US. So this isn't something, America can't just fly a government airplane to Colombia full of Colombians and drop them on the Colombian landing strip, right? So this is a negotiated deal. And Guatemala has been very much to the fore in these conversations, where their president, Bernardo Arevalo, has been engaged in a kind of constructive thinking through of how Central America is going to deal with this crisis. Because the migrant flow is dramatic, the undocumented migrant flow is dramatic, but as I was saying, 75% is coming from Latin America, and above all, it's Central America and northern South America. So there are 675,000 undocumented Guatemalans, we think, living in the US right now. And if all of them were expelled, it would be 10% of the Guatemalan workforce. So that would be a huge shock. So what we see is Arevalo and his counterparts in Central America concerting themselves to present a united front in negotiations with the US as best they can. So what Guatemala has done is to agree to a 40% increase in the deportation flights. And then within Guatemala, what they've launched is a so-called return home plan, which has 3 phases, which offers a dignified reincorporation to Guatemala for what the government there calls the anonymous heroes of the migration, right? There are fundamentally contrasting views of these people on different sides, on the US side and on the Guatemalan side, because obviously the remittances made by these brave people who are unwilling to engage in this extraordinary risky trek to get to the US are crucial to the well-being of hundreds of thousands of families, if not millions of people in Guatemala. So there are high stakes for the Guatemalan government in recognizing the significance of these migrations and the risks that people take, offering shelter when they return home. And crucially, the plan of the Guatemalan government is to develop educational tracks so that young people can continue studying in Guatemala and don't have to basically choose emigration as the obvious way to improve their own and their own family's living standards. So it's a spur, it's an impulse to governments in the region to think very hard about how much better use could be made of the human capital of these extraordinarily resourceful entrepreneurial folks that are willing to take these risks, and in migrating to the US, demonstrate their willingness to take the risks, to innovate, to be entrepreneurs, and also, of course, to spend money, because, illegal migration is not cheap. It's more expensive than the conventional route, the legal route, because you have to pay people off all the way along the route. So this is an investment which could be redirected into the home economy if the right policy framework was there. Of course, in many parts of Central America, the reasons why people migrate is that the local politics are terrible, violence, uncontrolled, either political or gang violence is rampant. And so the question of how best to accommodate the deported reveals really quite profound questions of development for the entire region. And it is, to my mind, a signal failure of North American, of US policy, that this whole problem is not understood more capaciously in these terms and on an adequate scale, right? That we don't grasp in the United States the huge challenge, but also the vast opportunity that lies in really large-scale investment in the region, because that's what it would take to staunch this flow and to make it more attractive for the most energetic young people in the region to actually stay at home.
Yeah, perhaps not surprising that none of that happens automatically. That potential is not used unless it's concertedly focused on with policy. But I guess I want to end this segment with a more general question, one, intentionally meant in a kind of Socratic spirit. I'm always kind of thinking about these topics we talk about and trying to sort of explore their boundaries. And this got me thinking about dual citizenship as a concept. And, just to begin with Trump's gold card concept, it's opening the door to not just immigration, but also eventually citizenship for people who are being extremely transactional about that process. You can essentially buy your way into becoming a citizen. And that reminded me how we've talked in the past about how people have different motivations for pursuing citizenship, some of which can be opportunistic, some of which can be instrumental, some of which can be defensive. There are all sorts of relationships to citizenship that people can have, and all of them can be, reflections of empirical realities that people living in a country feel. But I wonder if that's sort of related to a kind of normative question, which is, can a state then discriminate on that basis of citizenship? If people are citizens for purely opportunistic reasons, from a kind of ethical perspective, does that change the status of that citizenship somehow compared to, someone who only has one citizenship, never conceived of having another one, much less a purely transactional relationship to citizenship?
Yeah, it's interesting because the US until 1967 banned dual citizenship. I didn't know this. It's just been a taken for granted feature of my life. But it was in 67 that the Supreme Court struck down most laws forbidding dual citizenship. Only then. The oath of allegiance, after all, that I'm going to be taking requires you to declare on oath that I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state or sovereignty of whom or which I have heretofore been a subject or citizen. This is the oath that we will all take when we naturalize. So that's pretty unambiguous about the monopolistic claim of the American state. I think the de facto situation since 67 is the US simply doesn't press the point, with one exception, which we've talked about previously on the show, which is the IRS taxes. If you become an American citizen, indeed, if you choose tax eligible green card status, you will be required to pay taxes to the United States or at least declare. You don't have to pay, because generally speaking in the rest of the world tax rates are higher, but you at least have to make a tax filing. So that is one absolute claim. But thinking about this, I could have got your point, and then I began to think, hey, couldn't one expand this a little bit? And doesn't this ultimately come down to politics? Doesn't it come down to how one thinks about the relationship between the two identities that a dual citizen maintains? So under certain circumstances, like war, for instance, being German-American, as many, many millions of Americans were before World War I, became intolerable in, the age of 100% Americanism that was directed at German-Americans, and many of them chose to bury their identities as a result. But think about three cases: dual Mexican-American citizenship, dual Irish-American citizenship, and dual Israeli-American citizenship. And the valence and meaning of this, like you've pointed out, Cam, like structurally tense fact of being attached to two states. I mean, it seems to me in the case of the Mexican-American relationship, at least seen from the American side, there is, an arrogance, a racist, hierarchical assumption that anyone who's Mexican would consider themselves fortunate to be American, and so therefore American citizenship trumps the Mexican identity, right? And this, I believe, is the kind of emotional mood of many swearing-in ceremonies across the United States. The grateful people are, relieved and delighted to have finally crossed the threshold to American citizenship. Irish-American citizenship has a rather different quality, it seems to me, which is something more about the migration stories of the 19th century, the heroic narrative, because Irish-American identity is thought of as Catholic Irish identity, right? It's not thought of as Protestant Irish. So this is surviving the famine, coming to the United States, but then crucially, there is this 20th century redemption in which Irish Americans help against the power of the British Empire to make the Irish state. And then in the peace negotiations of the 1990s, Irish American senators and Clinton arrive in Dublin and London to broker the peace on the island of Ireland, right? So that's a very different form of dual citizenship. It's sort of complementary, and two different types of sentimentality and nostalgia blend together. And to my mind, the Israeli story is that in spades, right? It's even more recent, and it's quite clear, surely, that to a certain mainstream conception, being simultaneously an Israeli and an American is like doubling down on goodness all around. Like, it's two exceptionalist narratives that blend together and condition each other. The Israelis are thought of as latter-day equivalents of Puritan pilgrims, and it is the mobilization of Zionist groups within the United States, which has powerfully aided and helped the development of Israel as a state. And then American strategy thinks of Israel as its principal ally in the region, and so on and so forth, right? So their dual identity, dual citizenship is, it's a powerfully sort of supercharged package. And I think that, to my mind, would be the most, rather than thinking about this in abstract terms, that's a more illuminating way of thinking about the underlying structures that define whether or not dual citizenship is seen of as a cynical trade-off, a real conflict, or as in fact sort of vindicating some wonderful story about the world that you hold to be self-evident, that freedom was going to be born both in the United States and then in due course in the Holy Land and in due course on the Emerald Isle.
Yeah, this reminds me, actually, just hearing that your answer about a conversation I had at a dinner. It was some exhibition opening I was invited to, and was sitting next to someone who we got to talking about migration, and his views on the subject were quite negative. This was in Frankfurt, actually, and
I'm sorry.
Yeah, the exhibition was great, but the dinner conversation was interesting, unexpected in that sense. I mean, he was telling me about how he was against this law that was passed here in Germany that allows dual citizenship, because he was sure how it was being abused by all sorts of migrants to the country, and that option shouldn't be available. Dual citizenship wasn't even an option until a year ago or so.
Yeah.
And then I sort of listened to his explanation. And at some point I was like, well, this makes my life easier because, at least I have the option of applying for citizenship, and then I could share the same citizenship as the rest of my family. My kids are dual citizens. My wife is a dual citizen. And I was like, well, it would actually just, it would help me out to be able to do that. And he looked at me, he's like, but you're not a migrant.
And, yeah, exactly. Yeah,
and
yeah.
I said,
Yeah,
I said, I am literally a migrant. I'm
2 times over, right?
Exactly. That's right. But in the category, like the point is, like, I by definition was not a migrant because I was speaking to him in German, in proper German, and I was sitting at this gallery opening, and I worked, as he told me. He's like, I have a proper job, and so by definition, I was not a migrant in the first place.
Well, you do have to hand it to the US. It does at least have an elemental understanding of that fact, right? That blind spot that you reveal there is extraordinarily characteristic of Germany. Because there's just this undeclared racism that says migrants are basically Muslims or people of color
by definition. Yeah.
Whereas the United States obviously has a it's a republic constituted out of, in so many cases, the migration. And so there is, I think, at that level, a constitutional, legal, but really deep kind of political culture difference between the two places.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on your citizenship. I guess it's still, is it pending, or you've not?
It's still pending. Yeah. I'm still trying to figure out a ceremony I can go to.
Okay. Well, I will congratulate you in advance, I guess, but, and we'll see what happens on my end. Maybe I'll apply this year before Friedrich Merz takes the option away. We'll see. But we'll take a break here and then return to talk about brutalism. Hi, welcome back. Our next data point is 1951. That was the year of the first published usage of the term brutalism, or New Brutalism as it was then called, to refer to an emerging style of architecture. We all probably recognize brutalist architecture when we see it. It's defined by the use of reinforced concrete, particularly in civic architecture or public architecture in the post-war period in the West, but also elsewhere in the world. It's been a pretty divisive style of architecture. Many people like it and find plenty of aesthetic virtues in it, but other people hate it. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, the subject of a new film in the Oscar race this weekend, The Brutalist. We won't be talking about the film, but we did want to talk about the architectural movement. So, Adam, to start off with, brutalism is an aesthetic with very clear architectural principles, but its founders also claimed that the aesthetic was connected to a political ethic. And I'm curious if you could describe that ethic and what its connection is with the underlying aesthetic.
Yeah, so it's I think maybe best read in historical terms first and foremost, because I think the key idea is to differentiate between different types of modern buildings. So when folks look at square, chunky, massive modern buildings, you could feel they were all part of the same movement, and at some level they all are. But the distinctive thing about brutalism is that it comes out of its epoch, its time. And as you say, it's a movement that acquired a label in the early 1950s and was a quite conscious effort by a group of young architects, initially in Europe, but then with notable exponents in the town that we both share in the US, at Yale, Albert Kahn and people like that, Rudolph, who taught at Yale. Then there was a Harvard group. And the conscious effort is to try and find a new form of modernism for the aftermath of World War II. So there was a sense that the original phase of modernism, the steel glass curtain walls, the sleek, streamlined version of modernism that had come out of the 20s and 30s, Le Corbusier gets his start in that period, Mies van der Rohe, all of the kind of classic names, had to an extent been problematized, cast into question by the shock of the war, by the destruction wrought, amongst other things by, for instance, Junkers aircraft produced in factories in the east of Germany, shaped by Bauhaus architects, right? So there was a sense that there was a history that needed to be overcome and a moment that needed to be responded to, and that moment was tougher, it was rougher, it was more brutal, it was more self-conscious of the problems of the earlier phases of modernism. And we see this in painting, with Dubuffet and people like that, painting in the aftermath of World War II in France, who spoke about an art brut. But if you think about in Britain, people like Francis Bacon or Giacometti's, concentration camp-like figures of the human body, there is this effort after World War II to kind of radicalize and question what it is, in fact, to be modern. And the answer is that the brutalists give is not to retreat to twee, arts and crafts, William Morris, early Frank Lloyd Wright, that kind of what is sometimes called a new humanism, but to blast forward into an even more capacious willingness to embrace the realities of the present. So they articulated this in a variety of different forms, but it was a three-point program of brutalism would say a formal legibility of the plan. In other words, buildings ought not to be obscure and difficult to read from the outside. There should be a clear exposure of the structure. So the structure that sustains the building should not be clad. It should not be obscured. If steel or concrete is holding the building up, then you should be able to see it. And it should be, in fact, a conscious embrace of those materials based on their intrinsic qualities. Another longer series of points, a 6-point program, would be responsibility. And this is where we really get to politics. Brutalism was an architecture that, as I was saying, was struggling with history and the drama and violence of 20th century history. It's literally building in Europe, at least, on the ruins, and in the United States on the ruins left by the urban crisis of the 50s and 60s, which, as we know, if you've seen pictures of the Bronx in the 60s and 70s, looks as though a bomb has hit it, even though it hasn't. It's an architecture of truth. So it's a space that should reveal, Louis Kahn puts it, it's an architectural space in which it's obvious how it was made, so you don't dress things up. It's an architecture of objectivity, requirement expressed by the use for which the construction is intended. So make the building look as though it means business. It's use materials in an undressed form. That's the principle of rigor. It should be transparent so that you can understand the logic of the building. And it should, however, also convey an image. It should speak as a statement in the world. it's an architecture which doesn't pretend to be something other than it is, right? So Banham, the Rainer Banham, the British architectural theorist, described brutalist buildings as buildings in which you don't take glass, brick, steel, and concrete and pretend that there's something else. You let them be glass, brick, steel, and concrete. Water and electricity do not come out of unexplained holes in the wall, but are delivered to the point of use by visible pipes and manifest conduits. So the Pompidou Centre, in some senses, in Paris, is a transition from brutalism to postmodernism, I think most people would say. One can see also what the building is made of and how it works. And there's not another thing to see except that structure and the play of spaces that it creates. So it's a sort of literalism. Some people describe it as a warehouse aesthetic. It's also a polemic. It's brutal also in the sense that it doesn't care, that it's stubborn, it's resistant, it's in your face, it's not pretending to offer you something other than it is.
So again, there's a strong association between the movement and the use of concrete specifically. And I'm curious why that emphasis on concrete. I mean, is the reason for that material ultimately related to aesthetics or engineering principles or economics ultimately?
Yeah, I mean, the phrase itself, brutalism, has many different potential etymological origins, including obscure debates within the Communist Party branches of architecture in Europe in the 40s and 50s. But the most obvious reference is Le Corbusier, the great interwar French architect's phrase that modernism involved confronting béton brut, so the French term for exposed concrete. Raw concrete, if you like. And concrete it's a very strange material because it's both extremely ancient, right? The Roman Pantheon that was finished in 128 AD is still the largest unsupported, unreinforced concrete dome ever built. So the Romans were geniuses of concrete architecture. But the concrete that we're talking about in 20th century building is above all reinforced concrete, which was an innovation of the late 19th century. Concrete's very, very strong under compression, but it's not very good under tension. In other words, you can pull it apart. So you add steel to that, and then all of a sudden you have a material that is both heavily resistant to compression and also resistant under tension. And in the late 19th century, the techniques were worked out for steel reinforcing concrete, and that's what then launches concrete on its trajectory in the 20th century. But again, to invoke this distinction, the first wave of modernism used concrete, but to a degree buried it in the building, hid it behind steel and glass curtain walls and things like that. What the brutalist architects do is to bring concrete to the fore and to celebrate it. And concrete has extraordinary virtues. It's just a very fungible building material. It's incredibly plastic, so you can bend it, you can pour it, you can shape remarkable shapes out of it. And when its surfaces are skillfully dressed, it can be beautiful, like an abstract painting can be beautiful. And all of these, I think, were the reasons that were really to the fore in creating a broadband acceptance of brutalism. But on either side, both on the left-wing side of brutalism, which was preoccupied with social housing and therefore very interested in the question of cost, and which pushed towards prefabricated concrete construction, taken to its ultimate limit in things like the GDR, the East German program of Plattenbau, which were really like Lego buildings. And then on the other hand, in commercial applications, that issue of cost is also, I think, very much at the center, but it's only part of an alignment of different forces. And I think the ultimate exponent of brutalism would say, well, it's all of those things at once, and that's not a surprise. It's simultaneously aesthetic, engineering, and economic logics which drive us here, in political logics as well. And that is why this is so much of the moment that we're at right now, that in this material we see the convergence of these different forces in play.
So I'm curious whether this basic brutalist concept, which I think you've shown is a very refined idea at its origin in the 1950s and cultivated by very considered architects, I wonder whether the concept became debased through its widespread adoption, specifically by public planning authorities. I mean, there are all sorts of examples of brutalist architecture some of which hasn't survived because it's been torn down, because it's been so unpopular, or it hasn't worked well, or it's been considered an aesthetic eyesore. And I'm curious if the public planners were motivated by different ideas than the architects we've been discussing. I mean, were they more interested in cost cutting than the movement's more refined ideas? And does this kind of reveal a weakness maybe in the brutalist concept itself? I mean, did brutalism fail to consider, its social context, the history and the traditions of the places where it's being built? Did that sort of give these less considered public planning authorities an avenue to kind of create widespread architecture that was more shoddy?
Yeah, I mean, I think anyone who looks seriously into the history of brutalism does face this question of debasement. I mean, it's kind of a self-referential, paradoxical phrase, almost like, what the brutalization of brutalism is something that we have to account for. And we really do have to account for it because the self-conscious aim of the early exponents of brutalist architecture in the 1950s, all of this complex program they had of transparency, of authenticity to materials, was in the aid of actually overcoming what they saw as the insensitivity of the first wave of modernism to context and to neighborhood, right? So if you think of World War II as a modernist experiment and the destruction it has created in its wake is now a call to rebuild, how do you rebuild in the face of the fact that the first generation of modernism had been complicit in the utter violence of the century, right? There's few things more modern, after all, than a strategic bombing campaign, which had laid waste to too much of Europe and Asia. And so the Smithsons, in particular, thinking in the 50s, they read like Jane Jacobs, the great American urbanist who is seen as the ultimate campaigner against, modernist, grotesque city restructuring. The Smithsons who built, the icons of brutalism in Britain in the early 1950s talk about the need to develop a pavement politics, a doorstep philosophy, a sidewalk architecture. They construct their buildings so as to enable in 3 dimensions the world of community life that previously played out in densely packed tenement housing in the dock areas of London. They are explicitly, one of the reasons why they want to celebrate material is so as to be able to incorporate what they call found materials. In other words, go to the construction site and see what's there. The spirit of their architectural thinking is communal, and it is that of pop art of the same period, right? Don't pretend that you have to go to the museum to see art. Think about the way in which the world that we're in continuously produces aesthetic objects which are not the same as oil paintings, but themselves are worthy of attention and are in some senses the only authentic system that we have. And so something happens to this project and it gets flipped in a really dramatic way. And one simple thing to say about it is it gets Americanized, and in America it intersects with the forces of really large scale capitalism, the grand projects of urban redevelopment and intensity of urban crisis in much of the United States like nowhere else in the developed world, which then creates cities like the one that you and I know quite well, New Haven, which is pockmarked or cratered, or how are we going to say it, like stamped with these brutalist projects. I mean, Rudolph's car park in downtown New Haven is an object that I will never forget the impact of. It's really as though a kind of undulating concrete foot has been stamped into the middle of 19th and early 20th century urban space. It's staggering in its violence. And one's tempted, I mean, here, I think, really to think in terms of cycles, not in terms of the endless recurrence, but as a repeated pattern in which we see architectural movements self-consciously positioning themselves as vanguardist reforming projects, making remarkable interventions as the classical modernists of the 20s and 30s did, finding their projects then incorporated into a process of accumulation and power accumulation and urban crisis, which goes beyond the capacity of architects and individual planners to control, leading to this kind of brutalization of their projects, which occurs definitely to brutalism. And then retrospectively, this final move, which is kind of preservationist. And, we begin to see these extraordinary developments from the late 60s and early 70s of, defending Grand Central Station, the magnificence of that, in some ways cliched a neoclassical edifice against the disaster that befell Penn Station when it was redeveloped. And similar efforts, for instance, to defend St. Pancras Station, another kind of gaudy piece of neo-Gothic against the erasure that was impacted on Euston Station right next door in North London. So again and again we see this, and the ultimate irony, of course, is that brutalism itself has now become, as you were saying, a kind of a landmark of modernism, which has to be defended against the, in many ways, in their own right, highly unimaginative and invasive forms of routine modern development that go on in all cities driven by the imperatives of growth and the demand for offices and apartments.
Yeah, I can certainly endorse that description of New Haven as this laboratory almost of this period of urban planning. I mean, I even think statistically that this small city in New England received more money for urban redevelopment in this post-war period than anywhere else in America. And you can see the results across the board, both for worse and for better. And that parking garage by Rudolph that you're describing certainly has that effect, I think, on anybody who sees it. But at the same time, I think the most beautiful building on the Yale campus is also by Rudolph, the architecture building at Yale, which I would recommend anyone visit if you're in the area. It's, I think, a beautiful building and entirely an expression of this brutalist movement as well. So, the best and the worst, I think, of that movement are visible in New Haven. But I guess I did want to end by pointing out what seems to me as a kind of resurgent interest today in brutalism. And, it does seem like among people who are interested in architecture, there's a rediscovery of this movement. And I'm curious whether that rediscovery, in that process of rediscovery, whether the underlying ethical ideas that we've been talking about have been abandoned along the way.
Yeah, I mean, I think abandoned and literally demolished. There's a very strong contrast, a stark contrast between two brutalist icons in London. The Robin Hood estate, which was one of the last Smithson's brutalist commissions, was a classic brutalist experiment in public housing. It was put into an East London area, a popular neighbourhood of East London, which was formerly Docklands. It was a major hub of inward migration from Caribbean and South Asia, and the Smithsons designed this public housing project, which has, streets in the sky. It really echoes with what you might think of as 50 years of modernist experimentation in public housing, starting with the classic modernist projects of the 20s and 30s and culminating in these brutalist visions that almost immediately after its completion in 72 runs into the urban crisis in the United Kingdom, the declinist narrative, the shortfalls in public spending. It becomes increasingly derelict. By the early 2000s, there are plans afoot for its demolition. In the 2010s, the demolition then really begins in earnest. The Victoria and Albert Museum manages to save a 9-meter square section of the building, including an entire, I think, apartment complex for Britain, one of the great fine arts collections of world museums, and the building is demolished, I think, more or less completely last year. By contrast, the Barbican Centre, which many people will know from visits to London, houses, or has at various points housed, the Royal Shakespeare Company, has a library complex, a school, auditoriums, an art gallery, completed in 1982 into the heyday of Thatcherism in the middle of the city of London, the concentration of some of the greatest agglomeration of wealth, certainly in Europe, indeed in the entire world. Its apartments were never affordable for regular low-income tenants. And it is extraordinary. If anyone wants to see brutalism on display as its visionaries no doubt imagined it, you should go to see the Barbican complex, because it is it's a vision of large-scale monumental modern building. It has about it, if I try and visualize what, Aztec temple construction looks like with hanging gardens and water gardens, to my mind, it looks a little bit like the Barbican. And a top-floor penthouse apartment there with 4 bedrooms just sold for over $4 million. So that, I think, gives you an idea of the divergence that you could see within this same aesthetic paradigm. Indeed, in the realization of two, at some level, you would say both were social housing projects realized in different parts of London, under the same aesthetic imprint with radically divergent fates.
Yeah, that was precisely my impression when I was in London and at the Barbican. This was a couple of years ago. And it was very clearly an embrace of this brutalist movement by the upper classes, by the upper middle class bourgeoisie. And precisely in that it also excluded everyone else, right? I mean, it struck me that I don't know what the housing costs exactly, but it didn't seem to me that it was a diverse mix of people, living in the Barbican, above it or near it. And so, anyway, that is interesting to see where the movement has ended up today, which is not to say where it needs to go in the future, I guess. But we do need to end the conversation here for now. Good luck to the Brutalists this weekend, although neither of us have seen it. And we will be back, as always, next week. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.